In this talk, I'm going to look at and examine some of the mistaken ideas that a lot of readers seem to have got about Carlo Rovelli's recent book, Helgoland. It seems that there are a few mistaken people who are promoting the idea that somehow this book has some connection to Buddhism. In fact, Carlo Rovelli himself devotes a chapter to the central Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna, who was around in the 2nd century AD and was one of the primary philosophers of the Buddhist school of Madhyamaka, which is the Emptiness school of Buddhist philosophy. However, it seems that many people, when they read books by physicists such as Rovelli these days, don't actually read with much attention. Because the idea that this book has anything to do with Buddhism is, to be quite honest, delusional. As I've said in a couple of my videos, I don't believe people actually pay attention when they're reading books like this today. I think many people read books like this for dinner table conversation, and they don't actually examine the claims made very carefully.
I want to talk to you about a book I just finished just minutes ago. This is called Helgoland by Carlo Rovelli. But what I like about it is it's probably the closest thing I've ever seen from a physicist to kind of getting the Buddhist perspective on the nature of reality.
So that was a short clip showing that the Hardcore Zen man considers that Rovelli is probably the best way to understand modern physics and Buddhism. As we shall see, this is entirely mistaken. In this short presentation by Hardcore Zen man, he also makes some other quite strange claims. Just take a quick listen.
Quantum physics. And quantum physics is one of those things everybody gets wrong, especially people in what I reluctantly refer to as my profession. You know, you've got the Buddhist teachers try to delve into the waters of quantum physics without really understanding it. Occasionally I'll make a nod to it here and there, but I don't really understand it.
So Hardcore Zen man here tells us, basically, he doesn't know much about, if anything, about quantum physics. And yet, he claims to know that many people in his profession, which presumably is a Zen teacher, give false views of quantum physics and Buddhism. But if he doesn't know anything about quantum physics, how can he possibly know whether the views of other people in his profession are giving false views? And who are these people? One example he does give is a film called What the Bleep Do We Know? And this was admittedly a very disappointing, in fact an embarrassing film on the part of Amit Goswami, who is a very good quantum physicist. However, in this film he really goes over the top and set out to go into the outer regions of the New Age absurdity, so to speak. Like many New Age productions, by overinflating various discoveries of modern quantum physics and making claims that go way beyond the evidence. In a sense, it does bring the field of the relationships between quantum theory and Buddhism, Buddhist philosophy, into disrepute. I mean, it could be claimed that people like Deepak Chopra are also very woolly and go over the top, and equally are very destructive to serious research. But it remains the case, if hardcore Zen man knows nothing about quantum theory, how can he possibly evaluate what other people in his profession say about it? All very odd. This is one of Amit Goswami's books, The Self-Aware Universe, and it is actually a very good book. Amit Goswami is a very competent quantum physicist, and also he is very knowledgeable in spiritual worldviews. And this book is an internally consistent, logically argued, quantum spiritual worldview, which corresponds in many respects with the later views of the great physicist John Wheeler. It also overlaps with some of the central ideas of Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodino's The Grand Design in their chapter Choosing Our Universe. Mlodino would deny it because he's changed his mind now that he's not working with Hawking. But if you read the chapter, Choosing Our Universe, and read the central claims of this book, you'll find they're pretty much the same. So although it is true that Goswami went way over the top for whatever reason, and did this area of discourse a disservice by not providing a balanced and rigorous exploration in his film, he's written some pretty good books. I mean, this book is actually consistent with Zen perspective. I mean, does hardcore Zen man think that Zen does not claim that the ultimate nature of reality is mind, and that the ultimate experience is one of self-awareness? I think that's correct, actually. This is a very good book by B. Alan Wallace, who is got a degree in philosophy of science and is a meditation teacher and a very competent philosopher. Excellent book. Does hardcore Zen man think he knows nothing about what he's talking about? Wallace talks about the discoveries of quantum physics and their implications that the material world does not exist in the sense that lumps of matter turn out to be comprised of conglomerations of perturbations of the quantum field, quantum fields. This is modern physics. Can be shown to map onto insights of Madhyamaka and Yogacara philosophy. Does he not know what he's talking about? I've read these books. I have a degree in maths. I did first year physics at university. I've taught physics. I discussed these issues with a highly qualified physicist who's also a philosopher. I know what I'm talking about. I don't think Hardcore Zen Man does. In this clip, following short clip, Victor Mansfield's explaining modern view of causality arrived at within quantum physics. Victor Mansfield was a quantum physicist and Buddhist practitioner. Here he's talking to the Dalai Lama. Does he not know what he's talking about? I think he did.
Identify one nucleus, its decay into a different form is another example of an elementary quantum process. Okay? Great. Here's the punchline. Oh, conclusion. Much hard effort in quantum mechanics has established is that there are no substantial causes or cooperative conditions for elementary quantum events. In other words,
Hardcore Zen Man tells us that nobody, absolutely nobody, knows what they're talking about when it comes to quantum theory, quantum physics, and Buddhist philosophy. Is that true? What certainly does seem to be true is that Hardcore Zen Man certainly doesn't know what he's talking about, at least in the field of relationship between quantum theory and Buddhist philosophy, because he erroneously thinks that when it comes to Buddhism and quantum physics, Rovelli is your man. But as we shall see, this is entirely erroneous, because Rovelli is a materialist, and there are no flavours of Buddhism which are materialist. We shall have to investigate further.
To the understanding of reality, because that's the point. I think that's a key point. Science has at some point has told the rest of the culture that there is a simple mind version of materialism in which the world is just little stone bouncing around. It's only true in an approximation. If you listen to science and you look things better, reality is more complex than that. Not because there are magic spiritual things affecting things. I'm a naturalist. I'm a materialist in a larger sense. But reality is not just little stones bouncing around. And there is space in the physical reality for much more complexity than what instinctively come out from the cold, icy world of classical physics, so to say. Quantum physics is richer. It allows, and in fact, the last part of my book, I try to indicate domains where I think that we are misled by thinking that the world is like in classical physics, including when we think about consciousness or we think about things like that.
Yeah.
In this clip, Rovelli demonstrates his attempts, and for many people his success, at deception through word mongering. reality is more complex, he says, not because there are any spiritual or magic spiritual things. No, he's a naturalist, a hardline materialist, but in a wider sense. Okay? What's this new, fluffy, wider sense? There's more space in physical reality, much more complexity in this new view than there was in the cold wastes of classical physics. This really is just, it's a form of gaslighting. It's intellectual gaslighting through wordplay. But in fact, all he does is deliver the same dead hand of materialism in a new deceptive guise, as we shall see. Now here is an example of the kind of linguistic deception that Rovelli and other materialist physicists and philosophers indulge in. This is page 154, going to page 155. If we think in terms of processes, events, in terms of relative properties, of a world of relations, the hiatus between physical phenomena and mental phenomena is much less dramatic. It becomes possible to see both as natural phenomena generated by complex structures of interactions. The deception here is basically saying, if I produce a description which sounds like mental phenomena might just emerge from completely non-conscious stuff which has no element of consciousness within it, but if I give you a kind of wordy sounding consciousness creating bit of deception, please believe me. I mean, the level of deception is just so ridiculous that anyone who falls to that, I'm sorry, how do people fall for this nonsense? Let's be clear. If you're a mathematician, if you're doing an equation, if you're solving an equation, I can say, it is not allowable for you to add something onto one side of the equation and not add it onto the other. The reason for this is basically if you add something extra to either side of the equation, basically then you're unbalancing the equation, so you get a wrong answer. It is in fact an incorrect mode of mathematical equation solving. The way you solve mathematical equations is to manipulate either side, or if you need to add something to one side to help manipulation, it must be added to the other side of the equation. You cannot just add bits and pieces onto either side of the equation without also adding the same balancing quantity onto the other side of the equation. Now a similar condition actually applies to logical reasoning when you're doing metaphysical analysis of the possibilities within a metaphysical description of reality. If I'm engaging in logical analysis or logical exposition of the nature of reality, then it is inappropriate of me or incorrect. So just add in qualities out of the blue on a whim. If I were to say to you, fire is cold, you would wonder how I'd come to that conclusion. And if I say, oh well, you see, although fire normally has no trace of coldness whatsoever, when you add lots of bits of fire, loads of them, incomprehensibly loads of them, magically they become cold, you would think I'd gone mad. Equally, if I say matter has no aspect of consciousness within its nature, it is unconscious, completely unconscious, with no sign of consciousness and with no possibility of producing consciousness, which is the definition of matter, which derives from Descartes, and the definition of matter has not been updated. See, materialists use the term matter in a slippery, slidey way in order to say whatever they want to say, pretending in one context that matter is just the ordinary Cartesian matter that normal people think about when they use the term matter. And as I say, the definition of matter has not been updated. Physicists do say, well, you know, matter is congealed energy. Fine. But this is not what Rovelli is referring to, which is why he calls himself a materialist. Why, when he's talking about his relational theory, he talks about relations between material bits and pieces. He quite clearly does it. Do you want to know what he says about what his relationships are between? Here we go. Page 68. When we think of the world in terms of objects, things, entities, in physics we call them physical systems, a photon, a cat, a stone, a clock, a tree, a boy, a village, a rainbow, a planet, a cluster of galaxies. Admittedly, a rainbow is actually a perception. I think he may have got this a bit wrong. You know, rainbows, they're kind of in the mind. Rovelli. These do not exist in splendid isolation. No, rainbows don't actually, because rainbows don't exist at all if there's no mind looking at them. But there we go. That's a relation, isn't it? But it's a relation between mind and matter, but we'll go into this a bit later. Don't think you should have used this example, really. But anyway, these are the kind of relations he's thinking of, mostly between material bits and pieces, the relationships between them. He's using the term matter in a very crude sense. But as I say, physicists use the term matter in a slippery, slidey way. I'll give you an example from another book. This is the theory of almost everything. Another physicist. This is about the Standard Model. And Robert Erter writes that the laws of physics were saying that matter as we know it simply can't exist. It was time for some new laws of physics. And is the quantum field real? True. It describes the motion of matter. Is this the same matter as you were talking about earlier? and again. Dark matter has never been directly described. How then can we know it's not normal matter? So what is abnormal matter? I should just read out a definition of matter I've just looked up on the computer. It says, physical substance in general, as distinct from mind and spirit, that which occupies space and possesses rest mass, especially as distinct from energy. So here we have a definition which actually makes this usage distinct from energy. It has rest mass, it occupies space, and it is distinct from mind and spirit. In other words, it doesn't have qualities of mind and spirit. This was the original Cartesian, down to Descartes, definition, and it was a definition used right the way through classical physics, and it is still used in this sense today. Even though we know the appearance of matter comes from the quantum fields, physicists, when they're using it in this fashion, as Rovelli is, he means it in this formulation, which is why he's talking about relationships. So if we go back now, what's shocking about this is that it's clearly a contrick, a philosophical contrick, and Rovelli has been interviewed by quite a few people, including people who presumably think they're physicists or philosophers, whatever. Nobody seems to notice it's a contrick. If we think in these terms of relationships, look at it like this, and even though the bits at either side of the relationship have no possibility of producing consciousness, but ignore that, just think in these new fluffy terms, and magically you might be able to think the impossible can happen. This is what this means. It becomes possible to see both as natural phenomena. Well, of course, relationships between material entities is a natural phenomena, but according to Rovelli, mind is not, because he's ruled out, he's said that he's a materialist, he's a naturalist, and there are no spiritual qualities, there are no extra mental qualities in the natural world. However, he's now saying, but relationships are, so perhaps mind is just relationships between material bits and pieces. That's clearly what these few sentences, actually 2 sentences, state. So we spent quite a bit of time already just on 2 sentences showing that within the space of 2 sentences there is appreciable word deception. It's quite clear. And much of Rovelli's narrative or exposition is full of such word deception when it comes to the way he assassinates consciousness, moves mind and consciousness out of primary focus into a mere epiphenomenon, a kind of illusory excrescence from the functioning of material bits and pieces. Instead of reducing mind to bits of matter banging around, he's reduced mind to matter having relationships. And he's told us that, the term relationships is so weird, so kind of, full of space, that it must mean that mind magically arrives once we've got relationships between material bits and pieces. There's no... It is logical nonsense. If the bits of matter at the end of the relationships have no capacity for mind, there's absolutely no reason why relationships between these bits of matter could magically produce mind. Again, it's smoke and mirrors. And the fact that people don't see that they're being... I mean, again, I say he's been interviewed by people who, putatively, should be very intelligent. They're philosophers and physicists. But they're taken in by this. Incredible. Page 136. The conviction on which this book is based, i.e., as with Sean Carroll, in another of my videos, who says he knows the world is material in nature from his heart. And now we have Rovelli saying it's his conviction. Oh, so it's not experimentally verified, is that right? It's just a kind of conviction and you're trying to convince people through word deception. Okay, I got it. Okay, we are a particular case amongst innumerable natural phenomenon. Yes, well, as I say, people who believe that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality believe it is also a natural phenomenon. So this piece of word deception doesn't work. Yet who has never wondered, could we possibly be made of simple matter, particles in motion in space? How is it that thoughts, subjectivity, values, beauty, meaning, how can simple matter produce colours, emotions, and the burning, lively sensation of existing? Indeed. This is what the philosopher David Chalmers referred to as the hard problem. How is it that if you define matter to be completely non-conscious without any possibility of producing consciousness because it's absolutely non-conscious, which is the definition of matter, how can it suddenly become, even if you pile bits of matter on bits of matter interacting in all kinds of weird ways, it cannot become conscious? There is actually another philosopher called Douglas Hofstadter, who actually wrote a brilliant book on Gödel Escher bark, an eternal golden braid. And this is actually a brilliant, brilliant book. It is a classic and became a bit of a cult at the time. This is quite a long time ago. I was at Sussex University and I loved this book, except that again it goes in for the idea that if you can describe matter doing weird stuff in some way, you can then claim, because your description of matter is so weird, that it must generate consciousness, even though matter has no potentiality to generate consciousness by definition. What Hofstadter claimed was that if material bits and pieces get into a loop of self-reference, ooh, weird. Consciousness will arise from that. And he was so convinced by that, by this view, that he wrote another book called I Am a Strange Loop, in which he actually claimed that a cosmic pool of beer cans, empty of course, if they got into a weird kind of state of self-reference, would become conscious. Don't you believe me? Wait. Sometimes I think you can't make this stuff up, to be quite honest. I am a strange loop. When one seriously tries to think of how a beer can model of thinking or sensation might be implemented, the thinking and the feeling, no matter how superficial they might be, would not be localized phenomena associated with a single beer can. They would be vast processes involving millions or billions or trillions of beer cans. And the state of experiencing thirst would reside in a very intricate pattern involving huge numbers of cans. As I say, sometimes I'm utterly flabbergasted by the insanity of some of the materialist explanations of how completely non-conscious material bits and pieces could produce the world of consciousness. Utterly staggering. But as we have seen, Rovelli has just told us that it doesn't actually need for beer cans to become a self-referring pool. It just needs for them to be related. And if you think Hofstadter's proposal that a cosmic pool of beer cans which somehow become self-referring, whatever that means, would generate consciousness, Rovelli's claims are no less ridiculous than Hofstadter's, because their basic philosophical structure is the same. It is claimed that some putatively weird arrangement of matter, lots of bits of matter, in Hofstadter's case, beer cans, some vague sense self-referring, trillions of them, and in Rovelli's case, loads of bits of matter having relationships. In both cases, you've got bits of non-conscious, absolutely incapable of producing consciousness by definition, bits and pieces, doing what is claimed to be something a bit mystical, or whatever they think it is. It's still a material relationship of some kind. So Rovelli's view is basically, in its essence, not much different to Hofstadter's in its essence, and it is as ridiculous as Hofstadter's. Okay? Just because you've got trillions of beer cans all relating to each other, they're still non-conscious objects made out of metal, and the fact they're relating together is not going to make them any more conscious. It is necessary to add a point for clarity here. It must be understood that when I'm talking about Hofstadter and Rovelli, claiming that these strange configurations or relational configurations of matter produce consciousness. What I'm saying is that the claim actually is that these configurations of matter produce the experience of consciousness, but that consciousness doesn't exist in its own right. It is just matter doing strange things. I mean, the problem is the claim is so ludicrous and absurd that one often just uses the term production of consciousness. But for somebody who takes consciousness seriously, of course, consciousness has its own ontological validity as an aspect of the process of reality in its own right. For Rovelli, consciousness is just a kind of illusion generated by matter relating away together. What physicists, philosophers like Rovelli do when they want to take down the notion that consciousness could be significant in any way within quantum functioning is to attack intellectual targets who are easy targets. It is with sadness that every so often I spend a few hours on the internet reading or listening to the mounting of stupidity dressed up with the word quantum. Quantum medicine, holistic quantum theories of every kind, mystical quantum spiritualism, and so on and on, in an almost unbelievable parade of quantum nonsense. Well, this is basically just slinging insults. Is everything with the word quantum spirituality nonsense? Some is. I've looked at it. Some has credibility. I've looked at them. Loads. I have to when I'm doing my research. But what you do not find Rovelli doing is taking on someone like Henry Stapp. Mind, matter and quantum mechanics. Now Stapp is a highly qualified quantum physicist who discussed issues of the nature of reality with Heisenberg. And he has come to the conclusion that quantum physics does indicate reality is mind-like, not matter-like. Here's what Stapp says. We live in an idea-like world, not a matter-like world. The material aspects are exhausted in certain mathematical properties, and these mathematical features can be understood just as well, and in fact better, as characteristics of an evolving idea-like structure. There is, in fact, in the quantum universe, no natural place for matter. This conclusion, curiously, is the exact reverse of the circumstances that in the classical physical universe there is no natural place for mind. Now Stapp is not a New Age lunatic. He's not to be counted amongst the quantum frauds that Rovelli talks about. But Rovelli doesn't refer to physicists who are as qualified, if not better qualified than he, who come to different opinions. Why is that? The Wikipedia entry for STAP states about STAP's qualifications and background. In 1958, STAP was invited by Wolfgang Pauli to the ETH Zurich to work with him personally on basic problems on quantum mechanics. In 1969, STAP was invited by Werner Heisenberg to work with him at the Max Planck Institute in Munich. In 1976, STAP was invited by John Wheeler, to work with him on problems in the foundations of quantum mechanics. Dr. STAP has published many papers pertaining to the non-local aspects of quantum mechanics and Bell's theorem. STAP has worked also in a number of conventional areas of high-energy physics, including analysis of the scattering of polarized protons, parity violation, and S-matrix theory. Does that sound like a quantum New Age hippie? I don't think so. And yet STAP has completely contrary views to Rovelli. But Rovelli doesn't take on STAP's views. He prefers to throw insults at, quantum hydrotherapy or whatever. So we're on page 137 of Helgoland now. Quantum mechanics doesn't have any direct answers to these questions. Well, that's what Rovelli says. It's not what Rosenblum and Kuttner say in their book Quantum Enigma, Physics Encounters Consciousness. It's not what Henry Stapp says in his book Mindful Universe, although Stapp is very precise and very measured, but Stapp quite clearly claims that he thinks that quantum physics certainly involves mind rather than matter. It's not what Amit Goswami says, and for all his faults in producing a terrible film, his books are not bad, and he does give a very precise reason, and the reason is that at a quantum level there does seem to be an observer effect, and this effect has not been explained away by materialist physicists. They have simply insulted and tried to pretend that people who present even reasoned, clearly reasoned arguments must be lunatics. It's the way they do things. There is no takedown argument against the view that the fact that which path knowledge, when registered by consciousness, creates a particle from quantum potentiality, there's no takedown argument that this does not indicate some kind of role of consciousness at the quantum level. As I've said in other videos, this is not to say that human beings wander around beaming direct beams of intentionality to collapse wave functions, as some people claim. The claim is simply that consciousness is effective and functioning within the quantum realm in some way. Rovelli continues, I fail to see any quantum explanation for subjectivity, perceptions, intelligence, consciousness, or any other aspects of mental life. But this is not an argument. Rovelli is just telling us he fails to see. There is no argument, evidence, or precise reasoning why consciousness does not function at the quantum level. And I presented in previous videos serious argumentation why it makes more sense to think it does. But Rovelli, quite clearly, to go back to the beginning of this paragraph, the conviction, not evidence, not reasoning. There's no reasoning in this book whatsoever about consciousness. None. I've spent quite a lot of time just going through a very few sentences from Rovelli showing how essentially he uses word deception, and I could go through loads of the paragraphs in his book and show exactly the same kind of deception going on. It's philosophical fraud. I mean, when he's talking about quantum mechanics can't have any relationship to the brain, for example, there are aspects that involve the functioning of the brain at large scale. That is precisely where quantum interference is lost in the noise of complexity. Well, Jim Al-Khalili, in his presentation of quantum biology, has said that this was exactly the claim laid against quantum effects in biology, and it has turned out to be false. The physicists Jim Al-Khalili, Henry Stapp, and Michael Menski all assert, contrary to Rovelli's claim, that quantum effects do occur in the brain.
Why should it be there at all? But why are they materialists? There's a tremendous inertia from the philosophers of the past. And the philosophers of the past were in a situation where the world was understood to be a classical world, which was deterministic, in which the mind had no role. But that physical theory no longer is true. It's known to be untrue. And the new physics, quantum mechanics I'm talking about, has an actual role for consciousness to play.
So you look at the whole brain as a
Absolutely.
single quantum mechanical system.
Absolutely. That's the point. The whole brain can...
As do Penrose and Hamarov. Quantum biology claims that quantum effects are not necessarily drowned out in the noise in the noise of complexity of organic systems. Photosynthesis is a quantum process, for example. Bottom of the page, same page. Perhaps it is difficult to imagine how we as human beings may be made only of tiny stones bouncing against each other. But looked at closely, a stone is a vast world, a galaxy of swarming quantum entities where probabilities and interactions fluctuate. Again, this is word deception. Because if you have defined, which Rovelli has defined because he's a materialist, stones and the quantum phenomena associated with stones to not have any conscious aspect, that is the definition. Rovelli's definition not to have any connection to or internal aspect of mind-like functioning or mind phenomena or an inner state of awareness or consciousness, if that's your definition of matter, no matter how complex you claim matter is, it does not have the capacity for consciousness. And it doesn't matter whether you make them beer cans relating to each other, beer cans self-perceiving each other, beer cans circling each other, or whatever. They cannot give rise to consciousness by definition. It's logic. That brings me to the end of the first part of the talk on Rovelli's metaphysical nonsense. In the second part, we shall look at how it is necessary to use appropriate logical analysis when discussing such issues, and we shall examine in much greater detail what Nagarjuna really meant in his emptiness analysis and how Rovelli gets it so desperately wrong.